Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks, Pete. It's nice to be here and speak to you all about blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So my interest in this field started, well, about a decade ago when the financial crisis happened and I started learning about central banking and how the monetary system works. It's where I found my way into Austrian economics. I wasn't here for the morning session, but I'm sure you heard a lot of the framework for thinking and making economic decisions. We also heard a bit about how to analyze an economy, and it's about people, not data. I was looking at the same numbers that Davi was looking at, but did anyone notice with how much glee he mentioned that 90% state debt to GDP number? You almost looked happy about that number, but I cowered, I freaked out. I thought, what does this mean for the future of our currency? And the problems are not only here in South Africa, but also in other countries. And so that's kind of where my interest in cryptocurrencies and blockchain and these things started. My approach to this space has been to think about how to give people access to new technologies and currencies that could minimize the risk of the collapse of fiat central bank controlled currencies. So I'm not going to get into the economics of this stuff too much. So I'm going to give you quite a nice overview of the technology and how it works compared to existing currency technologies. But when a bank today creates a loan, so I'm not going to get into this stuff, so I'll just kind of tee it up and then I'll move into the presentation. But it's something to keep in mind the whole way throughout. When money gets created in an economy, a bank is creating a loan, basically. So when you come to, let's say, Investec Bank, and you want to borrow money from us and we make a loan, we at the same time create a deposit. The deposit numbers from all the banks effectively get reported to the South African Reserve Bank and the BA 900 data. And that's where the SARB, the central bank, constructs its money supply figures. Things like M1 and M2 and M3 and all this stuff. So money today, when you log into your bank account and you see a balance, what it's basically telling you is that you have a claim on money, banknotes, that sits in the bank. When you make a payment to somebody, the definition in the National Payment System Act in South Africa is when you make a payment, you're actually moving the claim on money. You're not making an actual payment, if that makes sense. You're not actually moving value itself. You're moving a claim on money. That, to me, is fraught with risk. So if money is a liability or a claim on somebody, well, what if that person can't give you anything? And that's the problem, fundamentally, that Bitcoin begins to solve. So with that, I'm going to get into this stuff. What's been really fascinating to me about this big debate, cryptocurrency or Bitcoin versus blockchain, is this huge divide between the technologists on the one hand and the bankers or the financiers or the investors on the other. So, just a few quotes. A guy like Peter Thiel, who's the founder of PayPal, a very early investor in Facebook, and numerous other massive technology startups, sees something as Bitcoin as basically a digital gold. Or somebody else like Jack Dorsey, who's the founder of Twitter, he's all in on Bitcoin. He's investing a lot of resource into the Bitcoin protocol. He's actually hiring people to work for the Bitcoin open source protocol, paying them a salary but not expecting anything in return. He's also the founder of the Square payments business, and I think he's generating about $1 billion in annual revenue from Bitcoin payments at the moment. And then a guy like Steve Wozniak, who's the co-founder of Apple, who sees Ethereum as the next Apple-like platform for applications. And you can now contrast this with the banker guys, which is where I work, so feel for me. A guy like Warren Buffett says Bitcoin is probably rat poison squared. Or Jack Bogle is the founder of Vanguard. It's like the biggest ETF company in the world. Says avoid Bitcoin like the plague. And then famously Jamie Dimon says Bitcoin's a fraud, on which he backtracked, but like strong statements, you know. But like, what's going on? Like, why this difference? Why this divide? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I think I'll get into that in this presentation, but to my mind, you know, not to my mind, to everybody's mind, the future is a closed book. We need to stay humble around trying to predict things. And what's really interesting to me is some of the historical predictions. And I guess this counts for both sides, both the technologists and the financiers. But somebody like William Orton, who was the president of Western Union, which was the world's largest telegram company in the late 1800s, basically said about the telephone, this telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. Or Thomas Edison, who says, fooling around with alternating currents is a complete waste of time. Nobody's going to use it ever. Or this guy, who was a pioneer of American radio and TV, said this wireless music box has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for a message sent to no one in particular? So we can kind of carry on. Thomas Watson, the chairman of IBM, which was the world's largest computer company at the time, obviously, in the mid-1900s, says, I think there's a world market maybe for 5 computers. But you need to understand the context of what computers looked like then. I mean, it filled this entire room. And so in order to run specialized operations off of that huge mainframe computer, you had to connect a wire to this thing and sit in another room where you could use some of the computing capacity in this room. And these guys never foresaw the innovations that would take place in order to put these things in our pockets. There's a bunch more, but there's another one. Andy Grove, the CEO of Intel. Nobody's going to have this personal communicator in every pocket. This guy's interesting. He invented the Ethernet cable, which we all use daily. Said, I predict the internet will soon go spectacularly supernova and then collapse in 96. So, I just wanted to mention that. I mean, like I said, this argument can go both ways, but I'm going to give you some context to the history of money now and what I think we could see happening. And I'm not going to say which of these technologies I think wins out necessarily, but you can kind of pick up the trend. So, bit of monetary history about South Africa. This is the Rix dollar. It was the currency of the Cape Colony in the late 1700s. It was basically silver money. There was a central bank at the time. It was created in the late 1700s. It was called the Lombard Bank. Has anyone heard of that central bank? So they were put in place to make sure that the South African one, Cape Colony. So before 1803, these banknotes had to be handwritten, and they were basically a claim on silver that was held in a bank. What then started to happen is the international gold standard became quite popular and widely adopted. Okay, before I say that too, in KwaZulu-Natal, the Zulu tribe were using assegai spear tips as money and copper. The Khoisan people were using ostrich bead shells for money. Cattle, you've heard all these stories. All across Southern Africa, there were many different currencies being used. Then the gold monetary standard began to gain traction in the mid-1800s, and the Lombard Bank, the central bank created by the state, effectively collapsed in the late 1800s. Because what was happening was that there were around 30 private banks, like we have the banks in South Africa, that were issuing banknotes, certificates, kind of like this, that would have had Standard Bank's logo on here, because they were around at the time, so I'm using their name. And if you had the certificate, you could pay somebody in it. That other person could then take the certificate to the bank to claim the actual gold specie, which was the actual money. Okay? There were 30 banks doing this, and these private banknotes were competing with each other. There were also 3 trading companies and 1 mining company also issuing money in South Africa in the 1800s. They basically beat the Lombard Bank, so they collapsed. Late 1800s, that's when the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek went bankrupt, and private money won, old money won, basically won it, came out on top. What then started to happen was banks couldn't be fully trusted in order to make sure that the number of certificates they were issuing relative to the gold in the vaults would match. And the SARB was created in 1921 to come in as a regulator effectively to make sure that banks aren't over-issuing these claims. because it would lead to crises. So what's interesting about that? The SARB, the South African Reserve Bank's less than 100 years old. Not very old. The first rand was created in 1961. Not very old either. The first rand coins, the 1 rand and 2 rand coins, were gold coins, and the rand value today of those coins, just the metal weight, are around 3,000 to 4,000 rand. And that's not because of scarcity, that's literally just the weight, the value of the weight of gold in those coins. And then obviously in 1971, around the world, these paper monies, these claims, these certificates, central banks and governments say, no more link between these banknotes and gold. So money becomes this piece of paper, and that circulates as money. Some interesting history. Okay, so money then, as a result, back in the day, gold coins or silver coins. What a bank was a vault. So in the 1800s, anyone who could safely store money, gold, could start a bank. There was no regulations around that. And what a payments company was a courier business. So Wells Fargo in America, which is today one of the top 5 banks in the US, was literally a courier company. They used to courier money from the East Coast to the West Coast. American Express had the Pony Express, and they did the same thing. So that's basically what payments are. So if you think about it today, what's money today? Well, mostly ones and zeros, and we'll get into that now, but it's like numbers in an Excel spreadsheet to the bank or the central bank. That's a bank data center. A bank is a data center that keeps track of these spreadsheets, and they're licensed to do so. And a payments company is literally like Visa, MasterCard, BankServe. They send messages around to say, subtract some numbers out of this spreadsheet and add it to another spreadsheet somewhere else. So fundamentally, like nothing's changed here, between that to that. It's just become digital. Okay. So this is a picture of Facebook connections, the social graph of Facebook, people around the world. We've become extremely connected through these internet protocols in a sense of communicating with each other. But when we look at the world of money, it's still extremely fragmented. So I'm going to explain to you now why. But the internet hasn't really solved for this. You think it's solved for it. It feels like it. But it costs around 1,000 rand for a bank to send money offshore. So if you want to send 10 rand overseas, the offshore correspondent bank is going to charge you $30 just to move 10 rand offshore. So what are the 2 major trends? I think the most important trends to think about with money is this is President Richard Nixon in America, who announced in this video clip that they were cutting the US dollar off of its gold backing, which I spoke about. But at the same time, Intel, in 1971, so this was set in 1971, also in 1971, Intel produces its first microprocessor, which meant microchips, which were previously produced for a specific purpose, became less important, and you can now have a microprocessor that are running in all our computers that would make something like personal computing possible. So what happens with these two is money becomes increasingly digital, obviously. So if you think about it, if you have money now, which isn't even a banknote, it's ones and zeros, it's numbers in a spreadsheet. Interesting example, VBS Bank, if you read their reports of what they were doing, they ran their largest loan book in an Excel spreadsheet, and you had to trust people at VBS Bank and auditors that they wouldn't be adding new loans out of nothing, which, like I said, would create deposits on the other side. They created R1 billion out of nothing in that Excel spreadsheet. And then when people started figuring out stuff was going on, they had to then go and get actual money from municipalities. By actual money, I mean regulated money. So money becomes digital. It's not like paper or even gold. So how do you keep it scarce if you can just create money on a spreadsheet? It's really hard to do. The consequences of that, this is a graph of from 1971 to today. The black line is the supply of above ground gold in the world. So you can think of it as gold money supply. And the red line is the US dollar money supply. So the supply of dollars around the world circulating has gone up 20-fold. And if you compare it to the rand, we've gone up 560-fold. And I can show different graphs, but if you start putting like Venezuela here, it's off the charts. It makes South Africa look like it's nothing. And it comes down to, like, how do you keep electronic money scarce? There's no way to do it. The technology can't do it itself. That's what inflation is. So, Wimpy king-size burger cost R3.15 in 1983, or the farmhouse breakfast, 2 eggs, crispy bacon, French fries, and a slice of toast, R2.70. Today, exactly the same breakfast costs almost 40 Rand. So the value of the rand, in terms of this meal, has gone down 96%, which is almost the amount that the rand's value has gone down against gold, 99%. So you see what's going on is, as more money gets created, as Jana spoke about, the value of the currency goes down, but the prices of stuff, so the prices of those wimpy meals compared to gold are actually unchanged. They're pretty much the same. The price has gone up massively in terms of rands because the rand's going down in value. If you look at asset markets, this is the South African JSE stock market in total return terms, so including dividends paid out, priced in gold, and you'll see it's flat. But in rand terms, it's going up. So anyway, what went wrong? What went wrong was there was no standardized protocol to store the state of financial information. So banks, for example, in South Africa, will run at least 100 to 300 different ledgers to keep track of deposits. Think about that. So every single bank in South Africa, maybe some of the new startup banks will have fewer ledgers. But to keep track of actual deposits or rand supply, the big banks are running between 100 to 300 different ledgers. So you multiply that out. There are no standards to how to do this. Like, banks can do whatever they want to do. They just need to keep within some other regulatory limits. And they've got to report what they're doing inside those ledgers to the SARB and other regulators. Like I explained, there was no way to keep digital information scarce. You had to trust a guy behind a computer. The technology itself couldn't verify scarcity and enforce scarcity, if that makes sense. So I can sit on Excel and I can create units out of nothing. The technology itself would say, okay, this guy's inputted more money. Fine. Doesn't care. The regulator's got to care about that. And because regulators who are humans need to care about that, as a result, regulatory system develops in silos along language and customs and nation-state boundaries, develops in an extremely siloed way. And that's why everything is so fragmented. To explain to you the blockchain versus Bitcoin debate. The blockchain is a new kind of ledger. That's all it is. We're not going to get into the technical stuff because we can get stuck there for an hour. But it's a place where new currency is created and minted. It's the place where you can go, well, it's the network that keeps a currency secure. And it's also the place where you can go and verify that it's actual real currency. Real Bitcoins is actually in that ledger, you can verify. It's similar to the watermarks on a paper banknote, or logging into a bank's data center and seeing, oh yeah, there's actual numbers in that ledger. That's all a blockchain does. That's a dollar, but this is also a dollar. So the difference is, what's the difference? The difference is who's making the rules for each of those currencies. You'll hear a lot of people talk about the value is not in Bitcoin, the value is in the blockchain technology. That's hilarious, because if you had to use a blockchain in Zimbabwe, for example, or in Venezuela, like so what? If you can create new units of money out of nothing, it doesn't solve any problems. So the minute you have a decision maker, whether it's a committee or an individual, who governs or runs a blockchain, you've lost all the benefits. Because the point of a blockchain is to have distributed consensus, to prevent that type of behavior. So the difference is in who makes the rules to these networks. So we've gone from a world of a gold standard to a world of a PhD standard. That's the American Central Bank. That's the Federal Reserve's Federal Open Market Committee, who people fixate on these days to try and get into the minds of how these guys are thinking. And I mean, when we used to analyze from one Federal Open Market Committee to the next one, literally the word changes from one to the next in order to try and predict what they're going to do the following time. So these guys' rules are extremely fluid, as you know. The gold standard was quite strict, naturally enforced. And the result of all of this is that money has basically become a legal and regulatory technology. So you've got to trust your regulators. You've got to trust your committees of people who run a currency. What blockchain and cryptocurrencies rely on is a computer protocol that all of us can run together, and the rules are enforced by the protocol itself. No human intervention. So we set the rules up front, we deploy the software, we all connect to it, it runs, and it's very difficult to make changes afterwards. So you can almost think of it as a Bitcoin standard or a computer standard. That's how I think about how governance for money is evolving and changing. So this is a picture of a payment system running on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. It's called the Lightning Network. And you can start to get a sense now for how these borders in the monetary system are dropping. And there's a money protocol that connects us in the same way that Facebook, for example, will connect us over other internet protocols. So I don't think you guys need a lot of convincing around this. Whose rules are most trusted, government or technology? I think it's hands down technology. But it's not just in South Africa, it's around the world. So this is a picture of Americans' trust in their government. There's quite a big bear market there. So distrust of US politicians is also on the rise. And as far back as this data goes, we're pretty much at record lows. And I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise. I think that's why there's so much tension in the US and their politics, things like Brexit and the Eurosceptics, and there's all sorts of political turmoil all over the place. And it speaks to the rising distrust of politicians in general. This was a couple of weeks ago. Trump said it called the Committee of Central Bankers at the Fed boneheads. I thought it was funny, yeah. Then Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank went and cut rates even more deeply into negative territory and restarted their bond buying program. Now, what's fascinating to me about this is 2 years ago, economists were predicting that interest rates would be going up for some while longer. And then suddenly, in the space of 6 to 9 months, everybody changes their views and everything's lower again. So you can see how the monetary rules, the existing system, are extremely fluid. And obviously a result of this is you can't plan long-term decisions around a monetary environment that's constantly in flux. You can't trust it. And obviously in South Africa, we've got even bigger issues than just interest rates. There's talk of nationalizing the SARB, on which I won't comment, but it wouldn't, other than to say in the short term, it might not be such a bad thing necessarily. I'm not saying I'm in favor of it. But longer term, it's not great, and that's why I'm still doing what I'm doing here. But interesting, so that's kind of park the government discussion. And then you look at trust, this is again in America, and you look at trust from the public in different industries, and you'll see how technology comes out top. Financial services comes down here, and then government actually comes in at 48. So when you have a currency system that's run by a partnership between financial services and government, they're not the most trusted, but technology is trusted. So I think everything seems ripe for adoption of this new technology, basically. I'm going to speak to the rigidity of monetary policy of a computer protocol like Bitcoin. So what you're looking at here is a graph over time. So from 2010 to 2054, so looking like, 35 years out. And then you've got supply of Bitcoins on this axis. Okay, the orange line is total supply of Bitcoin in circulation. And you can contrast it with a rand that goes like that. It goes this way, so predetermined, and you can't change this trajectory. And the growth rate of Bitcoin supply is coming down. This is all predetermined. It's in the software, it's in the code, and it can't be changed. Well, let me say, It's really, really difficult to change. Trump can call Bitcoiners boneheads as much as he wants. He's never going to change this code. For example, me as an economist now, for example, can predict. I downloaded this picture 3-4 hours ago, so you can take off 4 hours. There's a date and time to which the monetary policy for Bitcoin is going to change, and that happens in around 14 May 2020, when the rate of new Bitcoins that get injected into the system halves. Every 4 years it halves. And that's why that supply curve flattens out like that. So now, instead of having economists trying to predict what central banks are going to do and what banks are going to do and what's going to happen in an economy to try and predict what money supply is going to do in one country versus another, well, you can just work with almost absolute certainty of the supply of this computer protocol. And all you need to do is predict the demand for each. Something I'll get into in a moment. So, why is Bitcoin so volatile? Demand supply curve for currencies here, so bear with me. On this axis you've got price, on that axis you've got quantity of money in circulation. What us as economists, what I used to predict, still do to an extent, when I think about it, is we constantly have to predict how much the supply of a currency is going to increase. When the supply of a currency grows, let's say 10%, the supply curve shifts, which means if demand stays the same, the price of the currency goes down. When you think of that in South African terms, it's the SARB's mandate, they mandated to lower the price of the rand by between 3 to 6% every year. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. So they're constantly having to shift out the supply curve in order to achieve that. That's why money supply is constantly going up. All central banks are doing this around the world. What you have here, though, is a pretty stable demand curve. So that's quite easy to predict. But then when Davi was talking about, foreigners selling off our assets and the demand for the currency goes down, you can start getting volatility in the demand curve. But for now, it's pretty stable. Okay, so it's quite easy to predict. So what we try and predict is supply relative to demand, and those are the dynamics in fiat. But importantly, we're all using rands daily. We have it in our bank accounts. The demand side for the rand is very well established, stable. When you look at something like Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency, for example, you've got a fixed supply curve, which, as I explained, is extremely difficult to change. But because less than 0.5% of the world's population currently uses it and knows what its value is going to be in the future, demand shifts up and it shifts down. And as a result of that, price goes up and it comes down. So those are the differences. So that's how you explain volatility in this thing. When you study technological revolutions historically, things like the internal combustion engine, the internet protocols, you name it, the big technological innovations, it takes around 50 years for that new technology to become widely adopted. So out of interest, the first internet protocols were being connected in America in the 1960s. It feels like the internet is a much newer thing. In the 1960s, ARPANET was getting connected together. And then obviously it came into sort of mass public consciousness in the 90s, and then mass adopted and used in the 2000s. In the 1800s, after oil was discovered, crude oil in the US, not after it was discovered, but some of the properties of crude oil was discovered as a new form of energy. There were guys going around America to try and convince the whale oil salesmen in industry that crude oil was actually a better fuel for energy. And no one believed it. It took them 50 years, basically, to complete. We basically, only once the internal combustion engine is developed and created, does it suddenly become mass adopted and used, because it made sense in that context. So when we talk about blockchain technologies, we're around here right now. We're only 10 years into this thing. If it doesn't make sense, that's an S curve. It's an S adoption curve. So here it would be 7 billion people around the world are using a technology. Here it would be 0 people are using it. Here it's year 0. There's year 50. We're around here. So when you think about price and volatility on this graph, you've got to think about demand shifting up this curve, going from 50 million people today to 200 million people in 2 years' time to 3 or 4 billion people there. With the fixed supply, what does that do? So in terms of this is like an investment, it's speculative because it's a new technology, but we're still very early on. And I hear a lot of people saying it's too late, you can't get in. I think it's quite wrong. I'll kind of close off with this in the context of some other innovations. So I've focused mainly on Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a money protocol. It's purpose-built to just send and store information around Bitcoin. Okay, it's very kind of dumb, and it's a good thing. Like gold is dumb. Ethereum is a money protocol, but it's also a financial services protocol. So, said differently, or to flesh that out, on Bitcoin you can hold and transact in Bitcoin. On Ethereum, you can hold, transact, lend, borrow, earn, trade, long, short, bet, as well as a host of other things because it's more programmable. So I'm going to show you some examples of what that means and what that looks like practically. I could also stay behind and just do a demo of some of these applications if anyone's interested. But I've taken a few screenshots. So in the same way that you would use a browser today to browse to your bank's online login page, and you enter your credentials and you log in, you need to find a way to log into a blockchain. Okay? But before I get to that, when you log into think of this as a thought experiment. When you go to your online bank's login page, you put in your username, your password, you get a one-time PIN or another second factor authentication. It authenticates you, you get logged in. It's got your identifier, so it knows what piece of information or pieces of information to pull about you out of the data center onto your online banking dashboard, right? With blockchain, you do exactly the same thing. So you go to a web browser. I'm going to speak specifically to Ethereum here. You go to a browser like this, but instead of having a username and password as credentials, you have something called a wallet, which is a public and a private key, which is kind of like your username and password to log in. And how it works is you just install a little extension that sits at the top of your page, your wallet's in there, and with that wallet, you can now browse to any website around the web that's connected to that data center and consume information, basically, and consume products that a variety of different people are building. Another way of saying that, it would be like opening up our bank's data center at Investec to anyone who wants to build product and show it to our clients. So anyone's got an idea for a new bank product, we'll say to them, hey, we'll just come into the bank and come and build it. Or we don't even have to say that. They can just go and build it and just launch it. And they don't have to necessarily launch it from our online banking site. They can build their own site that talks to our data center. So if you start to think about that, millions of people around the world suddenly have access to this bank on top of which they can just build product and launch it out to clients. That's kind of what's happening with Ethereum here. So these guys have built an online banking dashboard for the Ethereum blockchain. If you've got your wallet, you basically just browse to it and you're logged in. Okay? That's my account number. I can deposit money. I can send money. An overview of my account. I've got different currencies in this account. It all knows this information automatically. History of transactions, borrow, lend, exchange. There's a bunch of stuff you can do. Something like this, for example. So I've now gone from this page, and I've just Googled another page called Uniswap, and I've put that into the URL. I browse to this website. It still knows my account number, but what it'll give me the ability to do now is to swap some of those currencies that I had down here. I can input one and output another one, do a transaction, and it would kind of be like doing a trade on the JSE, but I didn't need a brokerage account. I didn't need a market maker. I didn't need a JSC. I didn't need a custodian like Straight and CompuShare and all this stuff in order to effect this trade. It's literally all just happening from my browser. What's cool about this is I'm buying a currency from somebody else or another asset from somebody else, but I don't have to trust them. So the JSE is there to create a trusted environment for people who don't trust each other to trade with each other. What Ethereum does here, some guys have built this application that runs on the blockchain. I can come and use it, but I could be buying an asset from someone in China who I can't even speak to. Doesn't matter. It could be anywhere in the world. The computer protocol, the language we use to effect this trade is exactly the same. Which is, as I explained earlier, not how the financial system works today. This is quite a cool app too. So again, Ethereum, I was using a different wallet there, but if I was using the same one, it would know who I was. This is like savings and credit. It's a money market platform that runs on the Ethereum blockchain. So I can browse here, and this is basically a dollar coin. It's a dollar on the Ethereum blockchain. If I go and lend my money on here, at the moment I can earn 9.4% interest in dollars. You'll see I'd earned some interest already and my balance is that. But it's so easy. I mean, you click here, you click on the asset, you say you want to supply. If I've lent money on the system and I'm earning interest, that collateral acts as collateral to a new loan that I can take out as well. And again, I can do all of this without needing a bank. It's running on Ethereum right now. And there's a bunch of other cool stuff. I could demo some of these things, but this is a collateralized lending system. So if you own an asset on Ethereum, let's say a cryptocurrency called Ether, you can browse to this website. You can say, I want to collateralize 1 Ether, and I want to borrow dollars against it. And this all has the collateral rules, the covenants for a loan, everything's built in. So you'll see if the price of Ether drops to $178, I'm going to get liquidated, and the platform's going to take my assets. There's a penalty price that I would pay too. So basically, what's happening here is the business logic that sits inside banks and financial services data centers and inside their businesses is being reproduced on the internet, if that makes sense. Anyone can interact with this. So just again, money, as we kind of still use it today, I think is going to collapse into money banking and payments that all runs on the shared computer protocols on the internet. And it's only just in the early stages, but we're talking about it as the internet of money, and we need to find ways to obviously connect to this in a way that's safe, trusted, that adds value to our clients. The way that incumbents think about this today, incumbent financial services businesses, this is a graph from Clayton Christensen. He wrote a great book called The Innovators Dilemma. And he did these several studies on like excavation equipment that used to have cable arms to excavate and dig and trench, that moved to a hydraulic system, and how the hydraulics disrupted the cable system. The other one that's really interesting is he studied the history of hard disk drives and computers. It went from 8-inch disk drives to 5.5-inch disk drives to 3.5-inch disk drives. What was fascinating about that study is, and I'll tell you now how it relates, is when the 8-inch disk drive for computers was being used, the incumbent companies were all focused on servicing their customers in this trajectory or this plane. So they were using 8-inch disk drives for mini computers that were neither portable nor personal. And their clients demanded of them better 8-inch drives, more memory on the 8-inch disk drive. But there were these innovators down here saying, but we've innovated, we've built this 5.5-inch disk drive. Yeah, we can store less information on that disk drive. So instead of 18 megabytes, we can store 20. But it's smaller, so it creates new use cases. And where the mini computer industry got taken out was that the 5.5-inch disk drives were being used for personal computers. And the personal computers, when they were looking at it, were still down here in terms of capabilities and use. It wasn't interesting. It was a new segment, an entirely new market that to the big guys was too small. And what happened was personal computers obviously took out mini computers. as the capabilities of these technologies improved. And then, interestingly, the same thing happened with 5.5-inch and 3.5-inch disk drives. The portable computers manufacturers wanted better capacity out of the 5.5-inch disk drives and ignored the 3.5-inch. But what the 3.5-inch disk drives enabled was portable computers that took out personal computers. And it's basically how I'm seeing banks and the financial system incumbents viewing things like cryptocurrency and blockchain. It's being used currently in low-quality use cases like speculation and stuff like that. That in and of itself doesn't mean you should ignore this thing. Because when those capabilities I was showing you comes together and is properly developed out, my sense is this disruptive technology will completely clean out and change the way we move money and value over the internet. To illustrate, people talk a lot, and our former CEO just 2 days ago shouted at me and said, these things don't have scale. They can never scale to service the global population, like Bitcoin specifically. Bitcoin, currently when you do a transaction, and this is to speak to that hockey stick exponential innovation curve that's happening in the space. When I do a Bitcoin transaction today, I've got to broadcast to everybody here that we're doing a transaction. So everybody connected to the network knows about it. So it's expensive, and there's latency, and it's slow, and that's why it can't scale. But that's the base blockchain. You can build applications that run on top of it. So I mentioned the Lightning Network earlier with that picture of how people are connected to each other on the Lightning Network. And what that is, it's a bunch of programmers collaborating all over the world, this concept together. It is analogous to going to a bar at night and leaving your credit card behind the bar and not swiping your card every time you buy a drink. You leave it behind the bar until the end of the night and you settle up your bill. So the Lightning Network, what we do there on Bitcoin, send some Bitcoin into a payments channel that gets locked up there. And I create a payments channel, let's say with George, and there we run like a sub-ledger to the main ledger. And when we do a transaction, we're not telling everybody that we're transacting with each other all the time. It's not necessary, because there's some trust in the code that we're running that we can't cheat each other. But now where it gets cool is, it's almost like the internet's TCP IP protocol is if I have a payments channel with George and George has one with Pitt, I don't have to open another channel with Pitt to send him money. I can send it to Pitt, but it routes through George. So here's what's interesting about it. Whereas Bitcoin's transactional capabilities and scale is currently at about 8 transactions per second, which compares with Visa's transactions per second scale of 1,700. You're never going to compete with that if you just stay on this layer. The minute you go into the Lightning Network, each channel has 500 transactions per second scale, and there are currently almost 40,000 payments channels in the Lightning Network, which means the Lightning Network's scale today is around 19 million transactions per second, compared with Visa's 1,700. Now, I'd never get Stephen to slow down long enough just to tell him that, and that's why these guys are like, it's down here, we don't care, it's never going to get there. It's there, and it's going to get there. The thing is, now, when you start talking about tax, on the base protocol, for example, when I'm broadcasting to everyone that I'm doing a transaction, everybody can see, including SARS, including whoever wants to know what's going on, if they know who my wallet ID is. And there's different ways to figure that out. So you're more vulnerable right now to tax. You're less private if you're transacting in these networks. But if we go into the Lightning Network, for example, it's pretty private, it's instant, it's free. The reason for that is, if I'm sending money to Pitt, the transaction routes through many people to get there, and different transactions are routing over this internet all the time. So who knows where money stopped and where it started? It's almost impossible to figure that out. So where the regulators are going to have to go in order to monitor the stuff is to companies like us to say, Chris is connected, he's got a wallet ID, tell us what it is, tell us how much he's putting into his Lightning channels, which is not different to how they do it today. It's the same thing. So they're going to have to regulate companies who offer value-added services that run on this protocol. It would almost be like Internet service providers host domains and connect companies up to the internet. You can go there to kind of regulate the internet. It would need to be a similar thing here. The thing is, if they start regulating like they are now, it basically leads to innovations where companies don't want to sit with that type of information, because when you sit with data today, it's a liability. And so what we're seeing happening in this world is a kind of non-custodial approach to how you manage your money, which means, like, I've got my wallet on my phone, and no one but me can get in there. So the onus, I think it's going to be interesting, because if you calculate total taxation in the economy today, it's probably around 70% of GDP, including VAT, including customs, including personal income tax, capital gains tax, inflation tax, all these things. Has it not maybe gone too far? But because of the way things are set up, it's hard to change that, not just here, but around the world. But interestingly, the personal income tax has been around for only 100 years too. Before that, governments made money off of taxing international trade and property. And if people prefer paying less taxes and they use this technology in order to get that, well, that's like democracy in action. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out and the sort of political tensions that it creates. Kind of longish answer. It's complicated. But the same methods that they use today can basically be used. They just need to understand this technology. Okay, so on the hacking piece, the technology itself, so the computer protocol itself, Bitcoin and Ethereum has never been hacked before. You need to analyze the consensus algorithm and the incentives in order to secure the network, mining and that. Some of the newer blockchains are vulnerable to hacking. In fact, there was a new Bitcoin fork, which is like a copy and paste of Bitcoin that didn't have a lot of miners, and the network got hacked. Ethereum Classic, I think, also had a 51% attack not so long ago. So you need to stay to the dominant protocols. That's the first thing I'd say. But you need, energy consumption the size of not small economies these days in order to rewrite or reorganize the chain, which is just not feasible, economically not feasible. So the issue is, how do you manage your login credentials? That's typically done on exchanges, crypto exchanges, and they can get hacked because they don't have good security systems. They're not investing a lot on security because they make money off of trading. That's why there's a huge move towards custody businesses, Bitcoin custody. So some huge companies like Fidelity Investments in the US, so it's the third largest asset manager in the world, has announced that they're going to do custody for Bitcoin. I think that's a piece of this thing that needs to be solved. There's many innovative ways being built to solve it. So I don't know where it's going to end up in the longer term, but it's still a risk. And you've got to trust whoever's storing the keys or do it yourself. So the Bitcoin community has a very strong social contract around what they believe money is. They believe money should be sound and hard money like gold. And so they put the rules in early that's never been changed, that there would never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. And that's almost like the creed of that community. It's Bitcoin's social contract. Like, if you're a Bitcoiner, you believe in that. If not, you can go to another money that acts a little bit more like maybe the Venezuelan Bolivar or something like that. But if you like hard money, Bitcoin's for you. Ethereum's got a different type of social contract. It wants to take it further than just money. It wants some money, but it also wants decentralized financial applications to run on the system as well, which is where the lend and borrow and transact and all those other interesting things come in. So each of these networks have almost like their own culture and social contract. And so you need to understand that in order to know, to get what you're looking for.
Hartlike welkom by Sakeplein. Sake wat? Goeie vraag. Ek sal verduidelik. Sakeplein is eintlik baie eenvoudig. Dit is 'n markplein aanlyn. Lys jou besigheid, lok nuwe klante, kry sakevennote, kom bymekaar in sakekamers en nog baie meer. Om te sien wat Sakeplein en sy mense vir jou kan doen, registreer vandag jouself of jou besigheid op sakeplein.com. Sakeplein. Skep waarde, maak wins.